Cassandra, the mythical Trojan princess who could see into the future with deadly accuracy, but nobody ever believed her. Well, it turns out she is really up to the minute. She is absolutely still with us.
Florence Welch, that's Florence and the Machine, has got a song called Cassandra, and one of its lines is, "I used to see the future, and now I see nothing."
And so does her very good friend Taylor Swift. They killed Cassandra because she feared the worst.
And it's not just in music either. One of the favourite names to put alongside Greta Thunberg is Cassandra. Yeah, Thunberg being someone who sees the disaster of climate change, but no one is actually believing her.
But who was Cassandra really? I mean, that's what we want to talk about today, Mary. She weaves her way through ancient myth and art and literature, and she's always a little bit different in each retelling. But what is that story really about in ancient Greece and Rome? What is her story really telling us? And is there something more to it than this tale of a woman who constantly said, "I told you so"? And why is she in the air right now?
This is Instant Classics, the podcast that uncovers the ancient stories still shaping the modern world. And I'm Mary Beard.
And I'm Charlotte Higgins. Each week we dive into the myths and the dramas and the characters of the classical world to discover what they still mean to us now.
And this episode, it's Cassandra. I think it's worth filling in some basics about her. We're using the word really a bit much, perhaps because Cassandra didn't really exist. She is an entirely mythical character. Her story goes back to the mythical Trojan War, the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Unlike many Greek myths, somehow it has always got one foot in the Trojan War. And Cassandra herself is actually supposed to be a beautiful princess who is the daughter of the king of Troy, King Priam, who had an awful lot of children. You know, one version has 50 sons and 50 daughters. Cassandra's
He was a busy man.
He was a very busy man. So were his wives. She's one of these 50. But there's something special about her in at least the story that we tell about her, which is that she was given the gift. Somehow she had the gift of prophecy. But she had that along with the punishment that she would prophesy the truth, but she would never, ever be believed. There are various explanations of how that came about, but the most common in the ancient world is that her gift of prophecy came from the god Apollo. When she refused to sleep with Apollo, he punished her, not by taking her gift of prophecy away from her, because he couldn't actually do that. He punished her by making her prophecies never believed. So in a way, it's almost worse than not being able to prophesy at all, not to be able to tell the future at all. She tells the future, but she is destined never to be believed.
And where she comes into art sort of literature first, right, is in Homer's Iliad. That's where the earliest source in which we find Cassandra. And I guess what's interesting about that is that she really doesn't seem like the Cassandra that we think we know, right? She doesn't have this kind of big role as a prophet who's never believed in Homer's Iliad. She is described as, Priam's most beautiful daughter, and someone is going to come and marry her. An ally of the Trojans is going to come and marry her and fight on behalf of the Trojans. And that's the sort of little moment that she occupies in the Iliad, which seems quite puzzling if that was the first time you were ever going to read about Cassandra. It's like, wait, where's the story? Wait, isn't she supposed to say stuff that no one believes? But I think what that points to is something I think it's really important to think about and understand when you're thinking about myth, which is that, we tend to think of something called the story of Cassandra that starts in point A and ends at point Z, and it's sort of a mini biography of Cassandra. Perhaps because, if we were lucky enough to read uh, a book of Greek myths as a child, it might have had the story of Cassandra. But in reality, Cassandra's story turns up in different parts, different fragments, in different places, serving different purposes in different pieces of Greek and Roman literature and Roman art. And that's how myth works. It's not You don't get a sort of canonical sense of one single story being allotted to one character. Myth is flexible. Myth serves the moment. Myth is there in order for writers and artists to manipulate it. It's flexible. So, that's why we get sometimes characters in ancient mythology who seem very contradictory, because they behave differently in different stories. Or in fact, their stories may be contradictory as well. So that's why it doesn't mean that her story didn't exist at the time that Homer was consigned to writing, but it does mean that as far as the Homer of the Iliad was concerned, that she needed to serve this particular purpose in the story that he was writing at that time. Of course, we don't know who Homer is or whether there was someone called Homer, and we don't really know how these epics were composed at all, but just as a way of shorthand.
Yeah, and I think it's not that the myth of Cassandra, and I've just used the phrase "the myth of Cassandra," is particularly difficult in that respect. All myths are like that. The 12 Labors of Hercules, they're all the same. And they're because they're always on the go, they're always being reformulated. I think to some extent, for me, myth isn't a kind of noun. It's not the myth of whoever. Myth is really a kind of verb. What you do, you myth something. It means you take something, you take the story, you retell it, or you re-illustrate it. And I think one of the things that is most striking about Cassandra's story is that some of the most vivid representation of some bits of it come from ancient art, not from ancient literature. Now, I think that ancient artists did have a problem with Cassandra, because to illustrate a woman prophesying but not being believed is a bit of a challenge for an artist. How do you show that? Um, so the artistic repertoire from the ancient world actually focuses on quite a lot of very different aspects of Cassandra. And if there was one absolute favourite scene from Cassandra's story that artists picked on, it was not her prophecies. It was what happened to her in the very final days of just after the defeat of the Trojans in the Trojan War, when she has taken refuge in the temple of Athena at Troy. One of the Greek heroes comes in and drags her off the altar and the image of Athena. And this is often thought of. We don't hear much about this in literature. We know a little about it. It's often thought of as being one of the reasons why Athena had it against some of the Greeks. Not because one of them had, I'm afraid, raped Cassandra. That was not particularly why Athena was cross. It was the fact that Cassandra, had been dragged from Athena's altar. It was an insult to the godhead Athena. And so you have these, everywhere you look, on Pompeian wall paintings, on Greek pots, you've got that scene. And I was really struck, actually, although it didn't turn out to be a representation of that scene, but in one of the very new excavations at Pompeii, which are turning up new wall paintings, just in the last couple of years. One of the paintings there, not the rape of Cassandra, but it looks as if it is the early episode in the story where Apollo is being refused. Apollo is being turned down. Cassandra saying, "No, I will not sleep with you." And Apollo is then punishing her, or we have to imagine Apollo's punishing her with never being believed. It is the most staid and aggressively awful picture of a couple, because there's Cassandra on one side and a great gap, and Apollo on the other. And clearly it is, all is not going well.
It is quite funny, that wall painting, because they just do look so thoroughly pissed off with each other. I mean, it's a kind of, looks like a scene from a really, really bad marriage, in fact, rather than this a great, great climactic moment from myth. But we also have to face the fact, right, that some of the sources in which Cassandra appeared, we don't have anymore. So that's another frustrating thing, right? So there was an epic cycle of poetry in which the Iliad and the Odyssey were sort of part of the mix. But there were other long poems that we don't have anymore that told other parts of the Trojan War. And one of these epics was called the Cypria, and it told of the beginning of the Trojan War, which is not covered in the Iliad. So it's the causes of the Trojan War. And the sort of major cause of the Trojan War was that Paris, Cassandra's brother, Prince of Troy, goes to Sparta and abducts or seduces or persuades, the stories differ in antiquity, the wife of Menelaus of Sparta, Helen. So, whatever way it happens, Paris and Helen go off together to Troy, and then the whole of the Trojan War is about the Greeks, led by Menelaus's brother, Agamemnon, are trying to get Helen back. So we know from other descriptions of this lost poem that Cassandra warned Paris, don't go to Sparta. Do not go there. Do not go and get Helen. This will have appalling consequences. Anyway, she's obviously not the poor Cassandra. She could have stopped the war, but nobody believed her. So that was, again, we don't really have that scene in a kind of wonderful ancient poem, but there was a wonderful ancient poem at some point in which that scene appeared. And the rape by Ajax that you describe, Mary, that again, it has this kind of amazing, very vivid presence in Greek pottery and in Greek art, of Cassandra being hauled away really physically from the altar of Athena, very, very often, and it's extremely vivid and kind of upsetting and dramatic. But we don't have a poem that tells us that really. You would expect it to be sort of dramatically and lengthily described, and what we do, we have little references to it, including, there's not a household name, a guy called Quintus of Smyrna, who was writing in the 4th century, roughly CE, and he was writing stories of the Trojan War, and he refers to this. He tells this story briefly of Cassandra's rape by Ajax. So we're in the position of, if we want to get a linear version of Cassandra's story, nobody in antiquity did that. But if we want to do it, we have to piece it together from these different little fragments.
I think it's interesting that modern readers, particularly readers, they pick up on and give emphasis to different things. I mean, I think it's in terms of the visual image of Cassandra in the ancient world, it would have been the image of the rape. And I think a lot of people would have, if you asked the Greek and Roman in the street about Cassandra, that's one of the answers you've got. Modern retellings of Cassandra have not entirely, but by and large, marginalized the rape and concentrated almost exclusively on the unbelieved prophecy. Even now, I think you can see, we're selective in how we retell things. We pick out different bits. We dive into some bits and not into others.
That's right, isn't it? And of course, there is a big climactic moment in her story that is quite excitingly described by the Latin Roman writer Virgil. It's all about the Trojan Horse. Mary, do you want to tell us the story of the Trojan Horse? One of the best stories in the ancient world.
Yeah, and it's from the Trojan War, and it's a story that is not in Homer's Iliad. When I think we always think, if you want to know about the Trojan War, you go to Homer's Iliad. But actually, that's only telling the story of a few weeks of the war. That's one of the things that's very narrowly defined bit of the war episode. Homer's Iliad stops a long time before the actual end of the war. But there is a very famous version told in other ancient writers, and Virgil is one of Virgil's Aeneid. It's one of the best and best known versions of this. The Greeks are getting fed up, basically, at the end. They've been trying to conquer Troy for 10 years, and, they just hasn't worked out. And the only thing they can think of to do at the end is to try a trick. What they do is they build a great wooden horse. And the idea is, this is what they do, the idea is to pull this wooden horse to the walls of Troy and to kind of say to the Trojans, look, guys, we're giving up now. It's been 10 years. Let's call it a day. We're going back to Greece, and you take this as a sort of peace offering from us, a kind of peace present. The trick is that in the hollow belly of this horse, they have hidden some of their crack troops. And when the horse is taken into the city of Troy, then at night, the crack troops escape and the enemy is within, and they take the city from the inside.
Amazing they didn't think of it 9 years earlier. This is like 10 years into the war.
Bit late, but still brilliant idea. Now, on the Trojan side, there are two people who say, don't take that horse in. You'll have guessed that Cassandra is one of those. She sees the horse and she says, according to Virgil, that I know what's going to happen. This is really dangerous. And she has this quite small walk-on part, even there in Virgil, saying, don't take the horse in. The actual more famous version of the person who says don't take the horse in is a priest, not a prophet, a priest called Laocoon. And he sees what's going on and he is deeply suspicious. And he says to the Trojans, let's not do this. And he comes out, and this is Virgil's words, he comes out with what is still a kind of famous line, I fear the Greeks even when they're bringing gifts.
One of the great quotable lines, although it's very mean to Greeks.
Timeo Danaos, I fear.
Et dona ferentes.
Even when they're bringing gifts, right? And what happens to him is that he's actually directly punished for his warning. Because for some reason, and it's all a bit murky, out of the sea next to Troy, some sea serpents emerge. And to punish Laocoon for what he has said, they come and squeeze him. They kind of envelop him and they squeeze him to death along with his two sons.
Exactly. And the two sons, these two young sons, that's really gruesome and a very, very narrowly described, great detail, this scene in Virgil of these horrific snakes sort of squirming up from the seashore and coming to squeeze poor Laocoon and his young boys to death. I mean, it's almost like the gods sending out a signal to say, no, don't believe Laocoon. Don't. It's sort of part of the sort of smoke and mirrors of who to believe. What the gods want to happen and whom you should believe. But yeah, it's also becomes a very vividly artistically described scene as well. There's a very, very beautiful and famous antique statue, which is now in the Vatican museums, of Laocoon and his sons being kind of squashed to death and enveloped and killed by these dreadful snakes. But I suppose, one of the things that's interesting about that is that, two scenes, two different characters saying, don't do it, Trojans, do not take this horse into your city. And actually, the Cassandra scene is much less vivid and interesting than this very climactic Laocoon scene.
you've got this pair, and Cassandra is really a kind of supporting act to Laocoon, in this bit of Virgil. But I think it's also it starts to open up the kind of bigger implications of Cassandra's not being believed and Laocoon's not being believed. That it's not just about the frustration of not being believed. I think what it's pushing us towards, both Cassandra and Laocoon, is pushing us towards thinking about the heavy price you can pay for telling the truth. That
Yeah.
people who tell the truth can be horribly punished. Telling the truth is not an easy thing to do. And that, I think, Cassandra is part of that story too.
Absolutely. And of course, knowing what's going to happen is a torture to Cassandra, we discover in various other sources. And, imagine the scene. Let's just move the story on a little bit, patching it together from different sources. But, the Trojans drag the horse into the city, night falls, the soldiers evacuate from the belly of the horse, open up the gates. Suddenly, the city is swarmed by Greek soldiers. The Trojans are sleeping. They've relaxed. They've been celebrating the fact that the Greeks have disappeared. Alcohol has been taken, and the siege is on. And this sort of cataclysmic burning and sacking of Troy now actually happens. And in the melee, lots of things are going on. Lots of characters are escaping or being killed in a brutal way. There's a lot going on.
That's when Cassandra is raped by Ajax. It's at that
Exactly.
moment.
In this melee, that's when Cassandra is raped. And one of the you talked about this a bit before, Mary, but one of the sort of crucial things about this story is because she's raped in the temple of Athena, that actually changes the story of the aftermath of the Trojan War considerably. Because the goddess Athena had been one of the enormous supporters of the Greeks. Athena had been helping the Greeks to win this war. And at least according to some of our sources, the reason she turned against the Greeks, and that is because of this rape that happens in her temple. And that is going to affect what happens next to the Greeks and whether they have a good time or not after the end of their victory, after the end of their siege, and even in their victory, they're not going to have a good time. So poor Cassandra is raped, and then the next bit of the story, again we patch it together. This is a part of the story told by the playwright Euripides, who was writing in the 5th century BCE. And one of Euripides' favorite things to do actually was to pick up story strands from Homer's Iliad and turn them into a fully fleshed play. So he takes in, and it's in many ways a really wonderful play. He takes the royal Trojan women, the women who, Queen Hecuba and Cassandra, as well as Helen, as well as Andromache, the wife of the hero Hector. And he asks the question, so what's going to happen to these women at the end of this siege? The men are being slaughtered. The women are being rounded up. And Euripides puts us essentially on the seashore at the end of the siege when the Greeks are about to set off back home. But before they set off back home, they have to divide up the booty. And the booty includes these women. And Cassandra is one of these women. And I think one of the fascinating things about Cassandra and the role she plays in this, very moving and unpleasant scene, because, this is real collateral damage, that moment. This is what happens to women in war, and sort of incredibly vividly told by Euripides. But as far as Cassandra is concerned, she's standing there on the shore of Troy, and again, she knows what's going to happen. And I think we should take a break. But she has a quiet sense of triumph.
She knows about some very nasty punishment to come. And in fact, in Euripides' play, she's slightly uncomfortably triumphalist about what she knows is going to happen next.
Let's find out what happens after the break. So, what happens to Cassandra? So, let's imagine these Trojan women lined up on the shore, and Cassandra is now part of the spoils of war. The women lined up on the shore are allotted to different Greek commanders as slaves. So they have gone from being royal princesses and queens to slaves. Huge reversal. The worst thing that you can imagine happening to you. Your bodies are now the possessions of these Greek commanders. And pretty much that's where Euripides' Trojan Women ends, with these women having been allotted. But then there's a gap in our story, but we know that what happens is that Cassandra does, and she gets loaded up into the boat of Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief of the Greeks, whose possession she now is. And we're going to switch authors now to Aeschylus, who tells the story of what happens to Cassandra when Cassandra reaches Argos with Agamemnon.
Yeah, and it's Aeschylus is actually writing before Euripides. Aeschylus's Agamemnon, which is the title of the play, is one of the earliest Greek tragedies we have. The 450s, I think, BCE. But he's telling the story of what actually happens after what Euripides is describing. And it is the homecoming of Agamemnon with Cassandra, his sex slave. And the whole scene of Agamemnon and Cassandra and Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra is actually, it takes 500 or so lines, about a third of the play entitled Agamemnon. The play is precisely about that homecoming. And it is built on the suspense. It's not what's going to happen. It's how it's going to happen. Because everybody knows, the audience knows, that while Agamemnon has been away at the Trojan War, his wife Clytemnestra has taken a lover, Aegisthus. Now, that's not just because she's a fickle old thing. It's partly Agamemnon had killed their daughter Iphigenia on his way to the Trojan War. He had sacrificed her to the gods in order to get a fair wind.
Oh, one of the darkest moments.
So Chinese books of murder and treachery. But the bit of the Chinese books that we're seeing here is that when Agamemnon comes back, we all know that Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus are going to murder him. He doesn't know that. He thinks he's having a glorious homecoming with his booty, with his loot. And sort of halfway through the play, after we've built up to kind of think, yeah, is he coming? Yes, he's coming. I've seen a beacon to say that he's coming. He's soon going to be here. About halfway through the play, in come Agamemnon and Cassandra on a chariot. The glorious homecoming. And for a few hundred lines, Cassandra stands there on the chariot and says absolutely nothing. She is the great prophetess, but she is completely silent. And Agamemnon, with his wife Clytemnestra, start to debate about how exactly he's going to walk into his palace. And Agamemnon saying, oh, it's great. He said, the irony is just horrible. Great to now have a safe return home. And we know the one thing it isn't, it's not going to be safe. And Clytemnestra, oozing insincerity, says how much she's missed him and how terrible it is to be a woman whose husband has gone off to war for so long. And she says eventually, do come in. Do come in. We're going to, get you all freshened up, right? Agamemnon goes into the palace and Cassandra is left alone on the chariot. We know that actually she's going to be put to death too. But the question is, how is she going to get into the house? Clytemnestra tries to persuade her to, do come in. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do come in. But
Yeah. Does she speak Greek? Does she
She's
speak Greek? Sort of
and
amazing moment.
yes, and of course, it's kind of really puts you on the spot because Cassandra isn't a Greek, but of course she does speak Greek because that's what we're going to hear her speaking very soon. And Clytemnestra kind of gets a bit fed up and goes into the house. And I suppose the audience then imagines they're going to hear the scream of Agamemnon because they think Clytemnestra has now gone into the house, she's going to kill her husband. But we don't hear the scream of Agamemnon. We have several hundred lines where we listen instead to Cassandra, who is partly going to be interrogated by the group of old men of Argos, who are the chorus of the play. And for me, this is one of the most brilliant moments in Greek tragedy. And it's a moment which really adds something to the whole story of Cassandra as being the prophetess no one will ever believe. Because instead of, as we got in Virgil and other places, Quintus of Smyrna, if we go to him, instead of just being told no one believes Cassandra, what we see in her interactions with the chorus is the process of them trying to understand her but not believing her. So we actually see non-belief acted out. It's fantastic. I did it as a set book when I was at university, and it
Me
stuck with me ever.
too, me
It stuck with
too.
me ever.
And one of the amazing things about it, right, is that it's not that they are ill-disposed towards her. They're very sympathetic towards her. They're trying to be kind to her. And she is off into her kind of prophetic mode, and she's speaking almost in tongues. I mean, it's like highly, highly poetic utterances, which we, the audience, can kind of unpick and understand because we know what's going to happen. And if we were an Athenian in the audience, we would know what's going to happen. So we know what she's talking about. She's describing in highly poetic terms the way that Clytemnestra is killing Agamemnon. And it's not as if she's, oddly enough, it's not as if she's foretelling the future particularly. I mean, this is either happening right now behind the palace wall, or it's going to happen in 2 or 3 minutes' time. So she describes, but again, it's all a bit encoded and occluded and highly poetic, the net that Clytemnestra is going to cast over Agamemnon, her husband, as he gets into the bath. And there are all these sort of metaphors about keep the bull away from the heifer, the idea that the female animal is going to kill the male animal.
It is amazing because these chorus of old men, they're trying to follow this, but they don't see what she's saying exactly. So at one point they say, what man's going to be doing this? And they haven't grasped the fact that Clytemnestra has sort of said it's a woman that's going to be doing the killing.
Yes, yes, yes. It's full of irony. It's full of irony, and also this accounts for, just to flip back slightly to the Euripides Trojan Women. This accounts for in that play Cassandra's sense of triumph that you referred to before, Mary, because she foretells all this in a probably less interesting, slightly more stolid way than this kind of. I mean, I love Euripides. I'm being very mean about him, but this scene in Agamemnon is just, it has no parallel.
And it's amazing because she both prophesies the future, even though it's the future which is only going to be, a few minutes away. But she uses the same forms to as it were, to prophesy the past. Even though she's not part of the Agamemnon story, she doesn't necessarily know it like the audience know it. She has seen that there's this set of Chinese boxes of murder upon murder that go way back in Agamemnon's family. And so she's prophesying the present and she's prophesying the past as well as the future. And it is kind of chorus try. And they say, we do believe you. They try to believe her. They think they're believing her. But they don't
get it.
They just
Yeah.
don't get it. I think it's interesting how even modern translators of this are kind of flawed by Cassandra's language, because her first words when Clytemnestra's gone in, she's talking to the chorus, and they recur several times in what she says, is, "Ototototoy," right? An absolute scream of pain. When modern translators get to that, instead of putting "Ototototoy," they say "scream of anguish." So actually, the modern translator is confronted with the fact that he can't represent what he or she can't represent what Cassandra is saying.
There was a really brilliant solution to this in a production about 10 or 15 years ago in London, which was adapted and directed by the amazing Robert Icke. And he had Cassandra, who'd been, as we've described, silent for ages and ages and ages. And then Agamemnon goes in and she starts screaming in Greek.
Yes, that's good.
So, and then it sort of enacted that the sense that we can't understand what she's saying, but it also filled the room with the sounds of Greek, which was sort of wonderful. It reminded you that what we're watching is quite a very modern production, very freely adapted. It suddenly brought you back to, oh gosh, we're watching a Greek tragedy here. It was absolutely wonderful. And then she sort of starts speaking English, but again in this very, and it's almost like she's not agonized because she's not believed. It's almost like her agony is the agony of seeing so much truth spread out in a kind of extraordinary sort of panorama of past and present. And she wants to fling, and she eventually sort of flings down. I mean, she knows that her life is about to end too. That's the crucial thing here. What she works up to is that she knows that she's next. She knows this is going to happen. So she flings away her prophetic um uh, wreath and sort of lays down her this sort of extraordinary personal burden of prophecy. It's so moving, and she's got this great moment where it's super hard to translate, but she talks about human life as being like something you've maybe scratched on a blackboard and then is wiped out. I mean, this is some of the really great but super opaque, hard to read but glorious poetry in the whole of world literature. It's just wonderful.
She does go into the house and she is killed. And what sticks with me though is the sense that Aeschylus is not shying away from the big question, which is what does it take for us to believe or understand somebody else? And the chorus in their struggles go through all our kind of struggles with that. Perhaps we're not getting what she says because she doesn't really understand our language. She's talking a different language. Perhaps it's that she's crazed. And so he is walking us through the difficulties of what it is to understand what somebody else says. And all the time with this, I think, this absolutely shattering irony going on, because Clytemnestra at the beginning of this scene, in welcoming Agamemnon back, has been speaking absolute lies about her own loyalty to Agamemnon, how much she's missed him. And yet the chorus believe those. Cassandra is speaking the truth, but no one can quite get it. So what everybody's believing is the lies. And the only people, and this I suppose turns the spotlight onto the audience, the only people who have got a possibility of judging what's going on are the people in the audience watching it. It puts us as audience in an extraordinary position of observation and knowledge.
And it's almost like a distillation in a way of what drama can do, in a sense. It's not, it's the absolute distillation of show, not tell, right? We're not being told that she's not believed. We're watching her not being believed. We're watching her not being understood. We're watching her strain to express herself and that falling completely short. And we in the audience, it's almost like you want to rush onto the stage and kind of shake the
Yes.
chorus members and say, look, just behind that wall, that backdrop, they're killing the king, right? She's telling you they're killing the king, and they're killing the king. And this is going to happen, and nobody's going to be able to stop it, because unfortunately rushing the stage is not something we can do. Of course, it also allows Cassandra to describe, it gives us a very vivid sense of the killing of Agamemnon, without actually seeing it as well. So it sort of it does something brilliant technically in terms of describing the climactic moment of the play without us seeing it.
Yeah, and we hear him scream from off stage. And I think it's it is very much that that has perhaps the Aeschylean moment, actually. It's very much that which has captured the imagination of later writers, poets, and playwrights. Actually, for centuries. For me, it's that power that you see of actually watching what it is like not to be believed. And some modern writers, actually, I think, have really kind of squeezed that for us. And I know, Charlotte, that you've got one up your sleeve.
Well, I'm really excited. I'm even going to like bring this to the screen. This is obscure, right? I would be really surprised if very many of our lovely listeners have read Lesia Ukrainka's dramatic poem Cassandra. So this is a Ukrainian poem written in the early 20th century, and it was translated a couple of years ago. So this is very fresh in a modern translation in English. And the reason that I am into this, to most people in Western Europe, obscure Ukrainian poem is that I've been thinking a lot about Ukrainian literature recently because I've been um, reporting on Ukrainian culture in Ukraine for 3 years. So um, everyone I know in Ukraine is obsessed by this poem, Cassandra. And Lesia Ukrainka uh, she was a feminist writer working in the early 20th century. Crucially, she wrote in Ukrainian, which was actually, there were huge limits on being able to write and publish in Ukrainian under the Russian Empire. She was actually in the part of Ukraine, which was at the time in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so she was a little bit freer. And she's one of the pioneers of Ukrainian language literature. So we have these two figures in Leslie Ukrainka's Cassandra, Helenus and Cassandra. And Helenus is the sort of silver-tongued, politically able speaker who's actually a false prophet. In terms of in Lesia Ukrainka's story, we get the sense that he hasn't got what it takes, but he's very persuasive. And Cassandra is like a kind of absolutist of the truth and not believed. And in fact, is a great burden to her family because she can't moderate, she can't put anything into the language that's going to carry it usefully to her audience. So she's constantly frustrated and a frustrating figure, and a tragic figure. In the current moment, what's really interesting is that she reads to contemporary Ukrainians. It's almost impossible to read it without having this sense of it. Now, even I read it like this, that almost, Ukrainians have been warning Western Europe and America about the threat of Russia and the coming war and have not been believed. In this current moment, I think it becomes incredibly kind of profoundly tragic and speaking to the current moment for Ukraine.
I'm going to confess that I haven't read her, but I will. I promise I will. But I'm also going to confess that I'm, in some ways, I'm often slightly disappointed by the way that Cassandra has been so often incorporated into modern literature or modern song. I'm disappointed in a way partly by the trivialization of her. I mean, we mentioned Taylor Swift at the beginning. Well, why is Taylor Swift like Cassandra? Well, it's because nobody believes her in her battles with Kanye West. Well, sorry, there's more to Cassandra than just saying, no one believes me, they believe him. And I think that even in the rather more substantial ways that that Cassandra has been used, I mean, she is, for feminist writing, she is the absolute classic of the woman who speaks but is not listened to.
Yeah, the kind of women's speech not being taken seriously.
And I think that, she is a fantastic symbol of that. But there's a certain predictableness about that move. Now let's go to the woman who's not being taken seriously. And I have a favourite too, which I'm going to kind of match with Ukraine, and it is a little
I
bit.
want to hear that. Yeah.
It is a little bit easier. It's a poem by Alicia Stallings, called Cassandra. It's just a few verses in rhyming couplets. And Stallings studied classics, And it's absolutely clear that she knows this Agamemnon scene very well, because her poem is not just about the woman who's not believed, but it's about fundamentally our capacity to believe and understand each other, you know? And, one of her lines when she's thinking about this to say, I blame it on the human tongue. So she's thinking of Cassandra's prophecies as something about language and communication itself, which is really, I think, what Aeschylus is getting to. And I think that I was very joyous when I discovered the Starling's poem, because I think what it did was take me beyond that slightly predictable version of Cassandra and the kind of, oh, shucks, I've just told you that it would be dangerous to take that bend at speed and you ignored me and we ended up in the ditch. The, the kind of that really sort of terribly domestic version of what it
Yeah, and
is.
those domestic versions are always very kind of dreary, aren't they? Like some woman standing there with her hands folded going, "I told you so." And let's please agree that Cassandra is more interesting than that. And yeah, thank you, A.E. Stallings.
And many of these others, Aeschylus, and it sounds like Ukrainka. What they're saying is that Cassandra is not just I told you so. Cassandra is saying, think about what the conditions are under which we can believe or understand anybody else in the world. And that for me, guys, that for me is the bottom line for Cassandra. The bottom line is, how do we believe?
Mary, I think that is an amazing place to stop for today, but thank you everyone so much for listening to Instant Classics. As ever, we want to know your thoughts and comments, ideas, questions, and so if you have them, please do send them to us at instantclassicspod@gmail.com or on our social media at instantclassicspod. Bye!
Bye.